In a world ruled by kings and priests, a woman's body was not her own. It was property, honour and punishment wrapped in flesh. But what if one mistake of the heart could cost her not just her life, but her face, her name, and her soul? Between the 11th and 14th centuries, Europe's streets echoed with cries of women whose betrayal was branded into their skin. Their husbands became judges, the church became executioner, and the crowd became entertained. Would you have survived such a world? Tell me in the comments, because what you're about to hear isn't myth, it's history that Europe tried to forget. If you love uncovering the dark truths behind royal courts and forbidden sins, hit subscribe before we step into the shadows, where justice and cruelty look the same. In the early centuries of medieval Europe, the world was draped in silence and scripture. The church stood higher than kings, its words echoing through cathedrals and across villages that still feared the darkness beyond their walls. In this world, purity was not a virtue, it was survival. And for women, their worth was measured not by faith or wisdom, but by obedience. Priests preached that Eve had doomed humanity, and every woman since carried her shadow. A husband's honour lived within his wife's body. Her virtue was his reputation, her sin his shame. If she faltered even in rumour, punishment was swift and merciless, not because of love lost, but lineage threatened. The church's grip turned marriage into a contract of control. By the year 1020 CE, local parishes in England and France began recording cases of moral transgression. Women accused of disobedience or secret affairs were summoned before priests. Confessions were extracted not with proof, but persuasion. In one York parish record, a woman was forced to confess before the entire congregation, stripped of her veil, and ordered to kneel through Mass as a warning. The message was clear. Temptation was sin, and women were born of temptation. Love was sacred only when controlled, and desire was only safe when it served a man's name. Across Europe, from the valleys of France to the abbeys of Normandy, silence became women's armour. As the church's moral codes deepened, the law followed its shadow. Adultery was no longer a matter of private shame, it became a public crime. By the reign of King Snut, 1016 to 1035, laws in England clearly declared, if a married woman defiles her bed, let her nose and ears be cut off, and let her husband keep her, or sell her as he will. This was not justice, it was spectacle. The mutilation was meant to erase beauty, the physical mark of betrayal meant to warn every woman who dared to dream beyond her husband's reach. In Paris, early 12th century family court records show women accused of dishonouring their home were judged not by evidence but by character. A widow named Alex was condemned after a neighbour claimed she smiled too often at passing soldiers. Her punishment, public shaming at the market cross, no trial, no voice. In Germanic law, especially the Saxon Spiegel, compiled between 1220 to 1235, fidelity was described as a duty bound by flesh and law. A wife who strayed could be beaten, branded, or locked away until the husband's mercy returned. But mercy was rare. Legal scholars like James Brundage note that medieval courts treated the body of an adulterous woman as a map upon which guilt was to be inscribed. The crime was not passion, it was rebellion, and rebellion had to be carved out of existence. Even noble women who wore crowns of gold were not safe from the law's cruelty. Beneath their veils, fear spread like fire through every court and corridor. By the mid-12th century, Europe had learned how to control women without killing them, through humiliation, surveillance, and silence. The Church's sermons on purity became the soundtrack of daily life. Every sermon, every confession, every whisper in the marketplace reminded wives of their invisible chains. Communities became watchtowers. A woman could be accused by a jealous neighbour, an angry husband, or even her own priest. Fear was not just in the punishment, it was in the waiting. In some towns of northern France, women accused of unchaste behaviour were forced to wear heavy stones around their necks during Mass, a symbol of sin dragging them down. By 1150 CE, family law in York listed crimes of the flesh as offences equal to theft. The Church no longer needed swords, it had shame, and that was enough. Yet, in the margins of these same records, traces of quiet defiance appear. Notes written by clerks mention women who denied confessions or fled before trial. One entry reads, "She escaped before judgment and was not found again." These fragments whisper of resistance, of women who refused to let guilt be their only story. But for most, silence was survival. Their stories were erased by ink, their names replaced by labels, the sinful wife, the temptress, the adulteress. And as centuries turned, this system of fear became tradition. The stage was now set for what came next, the public punishments that turned shame into spectacle and morality into cruelty. By the early 11th century, medieval Europe had transformed desire into crime. Adultery was no longer merely a moral failing, it was a legal violation punishable by disfigurement, imprisonment, or even death. The law, entwined with religious authority, declared that women were vessels of both family honour and societal fear. To betray that honour was to disrupt the fragile hierarchy of kings, nobles, and priests. Under King Nut, 1016 to 1035, England codified these fears. Laws stated that a married woman who betrayed her husband could have her nose or ears cut off, a punishment that served as both pain and permanent mark of shame. This was not simply retribution, it was a warning, a visual message broadcast to the community. Betrayal leaves its scars for all to see. Husbands were legally empowered to enforce these punishments, a grim reflection of ownership over wives' bodies and obedience. In rural villages, these laws meant that gossip could become a death sentence. A passing remark about a woman's smile at a stranger, a fleeting glance from a merchant, or a whispered accusation from a servant could summon her before a local court. There, her reputation, as much as her flesh, was on trial. The medieval mindset conflated female desire with societal chaos, equating rebellion with threat. Ruth Marzo Kairos notes that medieval sexual codes instrumentalized shame, turning private acts into public matters of law. Even noble women were not immune. For the aristocracy, adultery threatened inheritance and dynastic power. A queen's or countess's secret affair could undermine legitimacy, destabilize alliances, and even spark wars. Their bodies became battlefields of legal, moral, and familial control. The stakes were never just private, they were political. By the 13th century, European law had systematized punishment. The Saxon Spiegel, 1220 to 1235, a Germanic law code, prescribed mutilation and branding as standard penalties for adulterous women. A wife who strayed from her husband's bed could have her face marked, her ears removed, or a hot iron pressed to her forehead, each act a permanent reminder to herself and the community. These punishments were public, ritualistic, and highly symbolic. The body became the ledger of sin, and shame was the ink. Legal scholars of the time, including James Brundage, emphasized that these punishments were as much about social control as about morality. Men were assured the legitimacy of their heirs, communities were reminded of the omnipresence of law, and women's compliance was enforced without recourse. The legal system itself was weaponized, using the body as a canvas for fear. In some towns of northern Germany, court records show that noble women accused of adultery were confined to towers until their husbands decided their fate. Some were allowed public penance, kneeling in churches with symbolic symbols of sin, like a red cloth draped over their shoulders or a bell around their neck to announce their shame. Commoners faced similar punishments, though less ceremonious, often performed in village squares, where crowds jeered and mocked. Ruth Marzo Kairos and Barbara Hannawalt both note that law and community functioned together to enforce morality. The church dictated what was sinful, the court codified it into crime, and the neighbourhood ensured compliance. The result: women could be judged simultaneously by God, law, and society, with little hope of escape. Among nobles, laws against adultery were not only about morality, they were about property and power. Lineage, inheritance, and political alliances depended on women's fidelity. A single accusation could destroy dynasties or provide rival factions with the leverage to seize lands and titles. For kings, dukes, and counts, controlling the body of a wife was controlling the future of their realm. In France, early 13th century chronicles detail cases where noblewomen accused of adultery were imprisoned for months or years. Their husbands maintained legal authority over their confinement, sometimes allowing public audiences to reinforce the consequences of betrayal. These punishments served as theatrical warnings to the entire court. disobedience could topple even the highest-born woman from grace. Even the church intervened in these cases, not to protect women, but to reinforce social order. Confession, penance, and ritualized shame became tools to preserve patriarchal hierarchy. A woman's confession, forced or voluntary, acted as proof of the law's reach and the moral order's supremacy. Trial by ordeal, though gradually banned by the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, was replaced by public humiliation and corporal punishment, equally terrifying in its psychological effect. By the mid-13th century, European law had perfected a system that merged moral instruction with physical enforcement. The body itself was a battlefield of sin and control, and while some women resisted, fleeing before trial, denying allegations, or quietly undermining the law, most became part of the silent, shamed majority whose suffering ensured that fear governed daily life. The legal definitions of adultery, the systematic use of mutilation, and the intertwining of morality with law did more than punish. They trained generations to fear not only sin, but the very thought of defiance. The consequences were eternal, shame etched into flesh, obedience enforced by terror, and a society where love, desire, and autonomy were luxuries that few could afford. As Europe moved toward the 14th century, these laws laid the foundation for the public spectacles of punishment that would dominate towns and castles alike. The next chapter explores how shame transformed from legal enforcement into public ritual, turning crime into theatre and morality into spectacle. The streets of medieval Europe were more than pathways, they were stages. By the 13th century, punishment had evolved beyond the walls of castles and courts. The shame of women accused of adultery was no longer confined to private chambers or legal scrolls. It was paraded, broadcast and ritualized, turning morality into spectacle and society into an audience. In Toulouse, municipal records detail women accused of infidelity being marched through town in iron collars, their heads bowed, eyes averted. Villagers jeered, children pointed, and merchants stopped their stalls to watch. The punishment was not only to discipline the guilty, it was to teach the guilty and the innocent alike that betrayal carried consequences visible to all. The iron collar, heavy and uncomfortable, pressed against the skin like the weight of judgment itself. Some records even note that the accused were forced to carry a bell or a symbol of sin, ringing with each step, proclaiming their shame to every passer-by. In Augsburg, punishment was similarly theatrical. Women could be exposed in pillories, bound and immobile, their nakedness or semi-nakedness reinforcing the humiliation. Crowds would gather, often pelting the punished with rotten food or mocking cries. The Church, having banned trial by ordeal in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, had effectively shifted the burden of judgment to public spectacle. It was no longer the divine that decided guilt, it was the community, the parish, the marketplace. Shame had become a civic tool, ensuring compliance through fear of social ostracism. These rituals were meticulously designed to humiliate. Forced nudity, symbolic mutilation, and public confession turned punishment into ritual theatre. Every gaze from the crowd, every whispered insult became part of the execution. Barbara Hannawalt notes in her studies of medieval crime that punishment was as much about social cohesion as it was about the individual offender. By shaming one, the community was reminded of its collective moral obligations. Yet the cruelty extended beyond physical exposure. Some women were made to wear specific garments marking them as adulterous, sewn with letters or colours signifying their crime. Others were paraded with emblems, ropes, bells, or painted symbols of sin. The acts were not instantaneous. They could last hours, even days, prolonging agony to imprint the lesson of obedience deeply into both the punished and the witnesses. Even nobility was not spared entirely. While the methods were slightly less degrading, the spectacle of public disgrace could reach courts and villagers alike. The Tour de Nesle affair, 1314, though slightly later, provides a chilling example of how accusations of infidelity could ripple across kingdoms, destroying reputations and altering dynastic fates. The psychological impact of these public punishments cannot be overstated. Women were taught that a single misstep could render them vulnerable to the collective gaze, reducing them from individuals to objects of fear and scorn. And communities learned that participation, through jeers, mockery, or observation, was itself a form of moral enforcement. Fear, shame, and control were intertwined. These parades of humiliation marked a turning point in medieval justice. No longer hidden behind legal codes or private chambers, punishment became a shared, performative experience. It was theatre, law, and morality all in one, a warning to women, a spectacle for men, and a tool to preserve hierarchical control. By the end of the 13th century, public humiliation had firmly entrenched itself as the preferred method of social discipline. Streets and squares had become arenas of fear, where obedience was enforced not by sword or trial, but by the unyielding eyes of the crowd. The next chapter will explore the instruments that made these punishments not only humiliating, but excruciatingly painful, turning flesh into a ledger of crime. By the mid-13th century, punishment in medieval Europe had grown more sophisticated, more cruel, and more deliberate. Public humiliation alone was no longer sufficient to control women or enforce societal norms. The human body itself became a canvas for terror, and specialized instruments were devised to inflict pain while preserving the moral spectacle. Among the most notorious devices was the scold's bridle, a metal mask fitted with a gag designed to prevent speech. Intended primarily for women accused of gossip, disobedience, or adultery, the bridle often included a sharp iron tongue piece that pressed against the wearer's tongue and jaw. Municipal records from Augsburg and Nuremberg describe women paraded through town in these devices, their voices silenced while the crowd mocked and jeered. The scold's bridle was both punishment and performance. It displayed control, enforced submission, and marked the woman as morally defective for all to see. Iron masks and cages were also used to prolong exposure and shame. Some masks had spikes or engravings to press symbols of sin into flesh. Others confined the head while leaving the rest of the body exposed. Records from Germanic towns note that noblewomen were occasionally subjected to these devices in private courts, while commoners faced public spectacle, reinforcing class as much as morality. Stocks and pillories, though simpler, were equally cruel. Hands and feet immobilized, victims were left in marketplaces for hours, often overnight, exposed to the elements. Communities participated actively. Food, mud, and even stones were hurled at the immobilized, adding layers of psychological torment to physical discomfort. Chroniclers from England and France report that these punishments were particularly feared during festivals, when larger crowds ensured maximum humiliation. A particularly sinister device was the dunking stool, often used for women accused of scolding or moral transgression. The woman was strapped to a chair and repeatedly plunged into water, a ritual that symbolized cleansing but inflicted terror, hypothermia, and sometimes death. Church decrees from the period, while forbidding divine trial by ordeal, paradoxically encouraged moral discipline through instruments that simulated judgment without formal execution. Legal manuals from Germanic and English towns reveal that executioners were not improvising these punishments, they were trained. Manuals detailed how to secure the body, calibrate devices to inflict maximum pain without death, and manage public spectacle. James Brundage notes that executioners of moral crimes occupied a specialized role, operating at the intersection of law, religion, and social theatre. They were enforcers of both corporeal discipline and community morality. Some instruments combined symbolic punishment with physical harm. Women accused of adultery might wear collars with spikes or inscriptions, designed to wound if removed or tampered with. Iron chains, bells, and rods were added to extend humiliation. Every movement reminded both victim and onlookers of transgression. The message was clear. The law inscribed its authority directly onto the body, leaving marks that would last long after the trial ended. Even the architecture of punishment was designed for impact. Public squares, church steps, and castle courtyards were stages for these instruments, where visibility amplified terror. The transformation from symbolic shame to physical torture reflected a deeper societal anxiety. As control over women's morality became increasingly entwined with social order, fear had to be made tangible, immediate, and inescapable. By 1350, instruments of punishment had reached a terrifying maturity. They were not merely tools, they were instruments of psychological domination, teaching that sin had consequences carved in metal and flesh. The next chapter will explore how these instruments, combined with community enforcement, created a culture where moral compliance was ensured not only by law, but by fear, observation, and the ever-present gaze of society. By the early 14th century, the culture of punishment and public shaming had left an indelible mark on medieval society. Fear was no longer just a reaction to specific laws or punishments. It had become a mechanism of social control that governed everyday life. Women internalized this fear, learning that a single misstep could result in public humiliation, mutilation, or even imprisonment. Parish confession records from York and Rouen reveal that many women confessed preemptively, not always out of guilt, but out of the terror of being accused. This pervasive anxiety extended beyond individual women. Entire families monitored female behavior closely, enforcing compliance through whispers, veiled threats, and social ostracism. Husbands, fathers, and brothers became both protectors and enforcers, ensuring that women conformed to societal expectations. Children grew up witnessing these rituals, internalizing the lesson that obedience, silence, and submission were synonymous with survival. Ruth Mazo-Karras notes that medieval fear was both psychological and physical. The threat of bodily punishment combined with the emotional weight of public scorn created a system in which compliance was nearly automatic. Women's behavior was shaped not only by law, but by the anticipation of communal judgment, a mechanism so powerful it transcended the courtroom or public square. The Church, once the ultimate arbiter of morality, became a partner in this culture of fear. Sermons, confession, and penance reinforced the notion that deviation from expected behavior was not merely sinful, but socially catastrophic. The moral authority of the clergy intertwined with the legal authority of husbands and magistrates, creating a network of oversight that reached into every corner of medieval life. Yet even in a world dominated by fear, traces of resistance existed. Some women learned to manipulate the very system designed to oppress them. Parish records and early chronicles describe wives who fled before punishment could be inflicted, seeking refuge in distant towns or religious houses. Others confessed falsely to protect loved ones or deflect suspicion, leveraging the community's mechanisms against itself. In certain cases, women turned accusation back on their husbands or rivals, exploiting the ambiguity of rumor and the weight of communal judgment. These acts of defiance were rare, but they illuminate the cracks in a society built on fear. Even within strict hierarchies, women found subtle ways to assert autonomy, proving that control was never absolute. These forms of resistance were often invisible in official records. The surviving documents, parish confessions, municipal judgments, and chronicles, rarely capture the cunning strategies women employed to survive. Yet, the fragments that remain hint at a quiet defiance that challenged authority, subverted expectations, and preserved dignity in a world designed to strip it away. Barbara Hannawalt emphasizes that while punishment and fear were effective, they were not totalizing. Communities relied on cooperation to enforce morality, and any disruption, through flight, deception, or subversion, threatened the delicate balance of social control. Resistance, though small in scale, was a testament to the human capacity to navigate, negotiate, and survive within oppressive systems. The shadow of medieval control did not end with the closing of the 14th century. The psychological patterns, gendered expectations, and fear-based mechanisms embedded in those centuries reverberated through European culture for generations. Women's behavior continued to be policed by societal norms, and the weight of shame and honor remained intertwined with social and familial expectations. Early feminist chronicles highlight how the lessons of the medieval period persisted, subtly shaping gender roles and reinforcing patriarchal authority. Reformist sermons and writings from later centuries reveal ongoing anxieties about female autonomy, suggesting that fear and moral surveillance had been internalized, leaving women to police themselves long after the instruments of punishment had vanished. Even today, echoes of these systems remain visible. Social control through shame, judgment, and surveillance persists in subtle cultural forms, from gossip to reputational pressure. The medieval obsession with honor and female obedience laid foundations for norms that continued to restrict autonomy, proving that the tools of fear can endure long after their physical instruments have disappeared. Yet the stories of resistance remind us that even in the darkest times, agency survives. Women who fled, confessed strategically, or manipulated accusations demonstrate that fear, no matter how pervasive, could never entirely extinguish the human desire for self-determination. These narratives, fragmented, partial, but powerful, offer a counterpoint to centuries of oppression, revealing courage and ingenuity in the face of relentless control. As the chapter concludes, it is clear that medieval Europe's punishments were more than legal measures. They were instruments of psychological domination, social cohesion, and fear. Yet within these structures, women found ways to resist, survive, and sometimes reclaim their autonomy. The lessons of these centuries are sobering. When society wields shame and fear as weapons, compliance is enforced, but human resilience persists, quietly challenging the systems that seek to bind it. The shadow of fear, control, and resistance casts its long arc across history, reminding us that the struggle for autonomy and dignity is timeless, and that even in worlds dominated by terror, courage can endure.